The small town of Willow's Edge was shrouded in an unusual stillness. Its cobblestone streets, usually bustling with the chatter of neighbors and the laughter of children, now carried an air of solemnity. The centerpiece of the quiet was St. Jerome's Chapel, a modest stone structure that had stood for over a century. Today, it hosted the funeral of a man who had been both a pillar and an enigma in the community, Elliot Graves. Elliot had been the kind of man whose presence filled a room without words, a retired watchmaker with a reputation for unmatched craftsmanship. His hands had restored countless heirlooms, ticking the seconds of countless lives back into motion. Yet, beyond his skill and quiet demeanor, there were whispers, dark, unnerving whispers about secrets he took great care to keep. The funeral was an intimate affair. Most of the attendees were familiar faces, neighbors and acquaintances who had grown up alongside Elliot or benefited from his precise, almost miraculous repairs. As the service commenced, murmurs gave way to the soft drone of the priest's voice, a soothing cadence meant to ease the weight of grief. At the center of it all, Elliot's casket lay closed, adorned with a modest arrangement of white lilies and a single, polished pocket watch that had been his favorite. Near the front row sat his only close companion, Max, a golden retriever whose loyalty to Elliot was the stuff of local legend. Max had been by Elliot's side for a decade, rarely leaving his feet, as if the dog sensed some invisible tether binding them together. Today, however, Max was restless. His large, expressive eyes darted between the casket and the priest, his ears twitching at every inflection in the sermon. Quiet at first, the dog's unease began to manifest in soft, throaty growls. Whispers rippled through the pews as heads turned to look at the dog. "Max, sit," a neighbor whispered, but the dog did not heed. Instead, he stood, his golden coat rippling under the soft light from the stained glass windows, and stared intently at the casket. His growls grew louder, morphing into sharp barks that startled the congregation. "Max." Father O'Connell's voice cut through the commotion. The priest was known for his gentle, measured demeanor, but there was a crack of tension in his voice that made even the humans in the room sit up straighter. Max, however, was undeterred. His barks grew more frantic, and he lunged forward, placing his paws on the edge of the casket, as though he wanted to see inside. The sound reverberated in the silent church, a jarring contrast to the sacred atmosphere. Father O'Connell hurried toward the dog, his face pale, his usual calm demeanor replaced by visible unease. "Someone control the dog," he said sharply, though his eyes lingered on the casket. A young man, Paul, who had grown up in the town and often helped with church duties, stepped forward and pulled Max back by his collar. "Sorry, Father," Paul muttered as he secured Max by the pews, but the dog's eyes never left the casket. His barks subsided into low whines, punctuated by the occasional guttural growl. It was enough to unsettle the mourners. The priest cleared his throat, forcing a tight smile. "Let us continue," he said, but his voice trembled slightly. Elliot Graves was a man of great character, whose skill and integrity touched us all. He lived a quiet, meaningful life. As Father O'Connell resumed the sermon, his words seemed less measured, more hurried, as though he wanted the service to end quickly. The congregation shifted uncomfortably, their attention divided between the priest, Max, and the casket that now felt like an unwelcome intruder in the holy space. Paul leaned down toward Max, whispering soothing words. But the dog's hackles remained raised, and his gaze was fixed, almost accusingly, on the casket. Paul, like many others, couldn't shake the feeling that Max knew something they didn't. After the service, the mourners spilled out into the churchyard, their murmurs growing louder now that they were no longer under the priest's scrutinizing gaze. Conversations swirled around Max's unusual behavior, with theories ranging from the mundane to the macabre. "Maybe the poor dog's just grieving," one woman suggested, clutching her shawl tightly. "But why bark at the casket?" another countered. "Dogs have instincts. They can sense things." "Superstitious nonsense," scoffed an older man, but his voice lacked conviction. Father O'Connell, meanwhile, had retreated into the church, ostensibly to prepare for the burial. Paul, tasked with staying behind to help load the casket into the hearse, decided to check on the priest. As he entered the sacristy, he found O'Connell pacing, his hands trembling slightly as he fumbled with a set of keys. "Father, are you all right?" Paul asked hesitantly. O'Connell startled, his eyes darting toward Paul before softening into an unconvincing smile. Yes, of course. It's just been a long day." Paul nodded but didn't leave. Something about the priest's demeanor felt off. O'Connell had always been a steady, reassuring presence, but today there was something fraught, almost fearful, in his manner. "I was wondering about Max," Paul ventured. "Do you think he—" "Paul," O'Connell's voice was sharp, cutting off the question. "Let it go. It's just a dog. Grief does strange things to animals, just as it does to people." Paul hesitated, then nodded. But as he turned to leave, he caught sight of O'Connell's hands gripping the edge of the table. His knuckles were white, and his fingers trembled slightly. The burial was scheduled for the next morning, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over Willow's Edge, the casket was locked securely in the church overnight. Despite himself, Paul couldn't stop thinking about Max's behavior and the priest's reaction. It gnawed at him like a splinter buried too deep to remove. That evening, he stopped by the Collins house, where Max was being temporarily kept. The dog, usually friendly and eager to please, was unusually subdued. He sat by the window, staring out into the night, his tail barely moving when Paul entered. "Hey, buddy," Paul said softly, kneeling beside Max. "What's going on? What did you see?" Max turned his head, his soulful eyes meeting Paul's. For a moment, Paul felt a shiver, as if the dog was trying to communicate something beyond words. Max barked once, sharply, then returned to his vigil at the window. Paul sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" As he sat there, the town clock struck midnight, its deep chimes echoing through the still air. And for a brief moment, Paul thought he saw a flicker of movement outside the window. A shadow passing quickly under the pale moonlight. Max tensed, his growls returning, and Paul's heart began to race. What secrets lay within that casket, and why did Father O'Connell seem so determined to keep them buried? Both figuratively and literally. Tomorrow, at the burial, Paul vowed he would find out. Elliot Graves couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest after Max's outburst at the funeral. The German shepherd's intense reaction wasn't just unusual, it was unsettling. The way the dog fixated on the coffin, growling low in his throat before barking sharply, felt less like grief and more like a warning. Something was off, and Elliot's instincts told him there was more to this story than anyone was letting on. Standing near the cemetery gates, Elliot kept his eyes on Paul, Max's owner. The man looked pale, his grip tight on the leash as he attempted to calm his agitated companion. Despite Paul's whispered reassurances, Max's ears were pricked forward, his body tense like he was ready to lunge. It wasn't typical canine mourning behavior. "Paul," Elliot said, stepping closer and lowering his voice. "What's the deal with Max? He's acting like there's something in that coffin that shouldn't be there." Paul's gaze darted around nervously before landing back on Max. He's always been sensitive. Picks up on things most dogs don't. But this, I don't know what's gotten into him." Before Elliot could press further, Max barked again, louder this time, and lunged toward the coffin, nearly dragging Paul off his feet. The commotion turned heads, and the murmurs among the small crowd grew louder. At the head of the gathering, Father O'Connell froze mid-prayer, his eyes darting between the coffin and the dog. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the podium, his discomfort unmistakable. "Please, everyone," Father O'Connell said, his voice slightly trembling as he raised his hands for calm. Dogs can sometimes react strongly at funerals. They sense our grief, our emotions. Let us continue. But the words rang hollow. Elliot didn't miss the flicker of fear in the priest's eyes, or the way his hands trembled ever so slightly. Something about this wasn't right. Why was the priest so rattled by a dog's reaction? And why did Paul seem almost resigned? As the ceremony concluded, and the mourners began to disperse, Elliot made a decision. He wasn't leaving until he got answers. When most of the crowd had left, Elliot approached Paul, who was crouched beside Max, gently scratching the dog behind his ears in an attempt to soothe him. Max still wasn't calm. His head turned sharply toward the coffin every few seconds, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Paul," Elliot began, "I need to know what's going on. Max isn't just upset. He's warning us about something. Has he ever acted like this before?" Paul hesitated, glancing toward the now empty gravesite before nodding slowly. "Once," he said, barely above a whisper. "Last year, we were walking near the woods, and he started acting like this, growling, barking at nothing I could see. Turns out, someone had dumped someone out there. His voice cracked. "A missing person. Max found them." Elliot's pulse quickened. "So, you're saying he can sense death? Or maybe something worse?" Paul shrugged, his face pale. "I don't know what he senses, but he's never wrong." Before Elliot could press him further, Father O'Connell reappeared, his expression tight and unreadable. "Sir Graves," he said sharply, "this is neither the time nor the place for such conversations. I suggest you let the family grieve in peace." Elliot stepped toward him, narrowing his eyes. "Father, I couldn't help but notice you seemed uncomfortable earlier. Almost like Max's behavior wasn't a surprise to you. Do you know something you're not telling us?" The priest's face flushed, but he maintained his composure. "Dogs are animals. Their reactions are unpredictable. Let it go, Mr. Graves." Elliot didn't miss the way Father O'Connell avoided making direct eye contact. There was something he wasn't saying, and Elliot intended to find out what. That night, Elliot sat in his dimly lit motel room, his laptop open, and a growing list of questions swirling in his mind. Max's behavior at the funeral wasn't normal, and Father O'Connell's reaction was even stranger. There was a story here. Elliot could feel it in his bones. He started researching the church where the funeral had taken place. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. St. Mary's had been a part of the community for over a century, hosting countless weddings, baptisms, and funerals. But as Elliot dug deeper, he stumbled upon something chilling. 2 decades ago, a young priest named Father Callahan had mysteriously disappeared from the church. His disappearance was never solved, and rumors circulated about his involvement in illicit activities. Local gossip hinted at ties to organized crime and a secret buried deep within the church's walls. The case had gone cold, but the whispers never really stopped. Elliot leaned back in his chair, staring at the grainy black and white photo of Father Callahan on his screen. There was something about the man's eyes, intense and unyielding, like he had secrets even the camera couldn't capture. Could his disappearance be connected to what was happening now? His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Paul. "Elliot, I don't know if I'm just being paranoid, but Max won't settle down. He keeps pacing near the front door, growling at nothing. I think something's wrong." Elliot's heart raced. This wasn't over. Not even close. Grabbing his coat and recorder, he headed for the door. If Max was picking up on something, Elliot needed to be there. Whatever was buried in the past, or in that coffin, was starting to rise, and Elliot was determined to uncover the truth before it was too late. Elliot arrived at Paul's house just after midnight, the air thick with the chill of an approaching storm. Max's deep, guttural growl greeted him before he even knocked. Paul opened the door, his face pale, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. He's been like this all night, Paul said, his voice low and strained. It's like he's guarding us against something I can't see. Max stood rigid near the window, his body coiled and ready, staring into the darkness outside. His growl wasn't just a warning. It was a challenge, daring whatever lingered to step closer. Elliot glanced out the window but saw nothing unusual. Still, his gut told him that Max wasn't reacting to shadows. Paul, we need to talk about what's really going on here. Something spooked that priest today, and Max isn't letting it go. If there's more to this, now's the time to say it. Paul hesitated, his hand gripping the edge of the table. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. All right. Look, there's something I didn't tell you at the funeral. The man we buried today, Walter, he wasn't just my neighbor. He was complicated. Complicated how? Elliot pressed, his voice steady but insistent. Paul swallowed hard. Walter wasn't a saint, okay. He had a reputation around here. A gambler, owed money to people you don't mess with. And a few years back, he was accused of something terrible. A girl went missing. People suspected him, but nothing was ever proven. He swore up and down he was innocent, but Max. He broke off, his voice catching. What about Max? Elliot asked, his pulse quickening. He hated Walter. Couldn't stand to be near him. And Max isn't like that with anyone else. He'd growl if Walter came too close, barked if he even walked by the house. I always thought it was just the dog picking up on the way people talked about him. But now... Paul trailed off, his words heavy with implication. Elliot felt a cold dread creep up his spine. So, you think Max senses something about Walter? Maybe something more than we know. Before Paul could answer, Max let out a sharp bark, his body tensing as he lunged toward the door. The sound of his claws scraping against the hardwood floor was like nails on a chalkboard, sending a jolt through both men. Elliot grabbed a flashlight and swung the door open. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. The quiet outside was deafening, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. Yet Max continued barking, his gaze locked on a point beyond the porch. Stay here, Elliot said. Stepping into the night, the flashlight wavered as he scanned the yard, his breath visible in the cold. There was no movement, no sign of anything unusual, but the sense of unease was palpable. Suddenly, Max bolted past him, growling ferociously as he tore across the yard toward the tree line. Paul yelled after him, but the dog didn't slow. Elliot sprinted after Max, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he struggled to keep up. When he reached the edge of the woods, Max was pawing furiously at the ground near an old, rotted stump, barking like he'd found something buried beneath. Elliot crouched down, his hands trembling as he began to dig alongside the dog. What is it, boy? He muttered, adrenaline coursing through him. Moments later, his fingers hit something hard. He pulled back a layer of damp earth, revealing a small, rusted lockbox. His heart raced as he pried it open. Inside was a tangle of old papers, photographs, and a necklace. A delicate chain with a heart-shaped pendant. Paul caught up, panting. What is that? He asked, his voice barely audible. Elliot held up the necklace. I don't know, but we're going to find out. Back inside the house, they sifted through the contents of the lockbox. The photographs showed Walter with a young woman. A girl, really no older than 16. The same girl who'd gone missing years ago. The one Walter was suspected of hurting. Paul's hands shook as he stared at the images. That's her. That's Emily. Elliot's mind raced. If Max found this, it means someone wanted this hidden. Someone wanted to make sure the truth stayed buried. But why now? Why did Max react so strongly at the funeral? Paul's face went pale. You don't think? The thought hit Elliot like a punch to the gut. Walter didn't just take secrets to the grave. He might not have gone there alone. Max let out a low growl. His body pressed against the door, as though guarding them from an unseen threat. The priest's nervousness at the funeral, the way Max had reacted to the coffin, it all pointed to one horrifying conclusion. "Paul," Elliot said, his voice barely a whisper, "we need to get back to that cemetery. Right now." The truth wasn't just buried. It was clawing its way to the surface, and whatever waited in the darkness wasn't done with them yet. The drive back to the cemetery was silent, but charged with a palpable tension. Paul gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he navigated the dark, winding roads. Max sat rigidly in the back seat, his eyes fixed on the passing scenery, as if he knew exactly where they were going. Elliot sat beside him, the rusted lockbox clutched tightly in his lap, its contents rattling softly with each bump in the road. "Do you think we'll find anything?" Paul asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Elliot hesitated before answering. "If Max is right, and let's face it, he hasn't been wrong yet, we're about to uncover something no one else has dared to. Something unfinished." As they pulled into the cemetery, the air seemed heavier, colder, as though the ground itself resisted their presence. The moon hung low, casting long, skeletal shadows across the graves. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under their feet as they stepped out of the car. Max leapt out and immediately began barking, his nose to the ground, leading them toward Walter's freshly filled grave. The priest had been unnerved, the dog's behavior erratic, and now the pieces were falling into place. "Are we really doing this?" Paul asked, his voice trembling. "We don't have a choice," Elliot said firmly. "Something was left behind, and Max isn't going to let us walk away." They approached the grave, the soil still loose and uneven from the burial earlier that day. Max began pawing at the dirt, his growls low and constant. Elliot and Paul exchanged a glance, then grabbed the shovels they had brought, their breaths visible in the cold night air. As they dug, the silence of the cemetery pressed in around them. Each shovelful of dirt felt heavier than the last, the weight of their actions sinking into their bones. Max stood watch, his ears perked and his eyes scanning the shadows. Finally, the metal edge of Elliot's shovel hit wood. He froze, glancing at Paul. "Here we go." They cleared the rest of the dirt, exposing the lid of Walter's coffin. Elliot reached for the crowbar, his hands shaking as he pried it open. The wood creaked, and with one final effort, the lid was thrown back. Inside lay Walter's body, pale and stiff, his features twisted in an expression of terror. But it wasn't the sight of the corpse that made them recoil. It was the unnatural presence around it. A faint but undeniable feeling of malice radiated from the coffin, filling the air with a cold that seeped into their very souls. "What is that?" Paul whispered, stepping back. Elliot didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on something tucked into the folds of Walter's suit. A crumpled piece of paper, yellowed with age, rested against his chest. Elliot reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing the parchment. The moment he touched it, Max let out a sharp bark, his body tense. Elliot unfolded the paper, revealing a hastily scrawled confession. The words were uneven, the handwriting frantic, as if written in desperation. "I did it," the note began. "I didn't mean to, but I did. Emily didn't deserve it. I was drunk. I didn't think, please forgive me. God forgive me." Paul's face went pale as he read over Elliot's shoulder. "Emily, he killed her." Elliot nodded grimly. "And he knew it would come out eventually. That's why he buried this. Why he tried to take it to his grave." Max barked again, snapping their attention back to the coffin. The air seemed to shift, growing colder, heavier. A low, guttural sound echoed through the cemetery, a sound that didn't belong to any living creature. "Did you hear that?" Paul asked, his voice trembling. Before Elliot could respond, a shadow passed over them, darker than the night itself. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, as an oppressive presence seemed to fill the cemetery. Max stood protectively in front of them, growling fiercely, his teeth bared. "It's him," Paul whispered. It's Walter. The shadow coalesced near the grave, taking on a faintly human shape. Its features were distorted, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. But the malice in its presence was unmistakable. Elliot clutched the confession tightly. "You can't have this," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "The truth is out now. You can't hide anymore." The shadow surged forward, but Max lunged, barking furiously, his body a wall between them and the spectral figure. The growls from the golden retriever echoed like a challenge, his defiance unwavering. Paul's voice broke the tension. "What do we do? How do we stop this?" Elliot looked at the confession, then at the shadow. "It's not about stopping it. It's about ending it." He grabbed the lockbox and placed the confession inside, snapping the lid shut. Walter's spirit is tied to his guilt. He couldn't face what he did, so he tried to bury it. But we're not going to let him. With Max guarding them, Elliot and Paul carried the lockbox to the center of the cemetery, where a small fire pit used for ceremonial purposes stood. Elliot lit a match, the flame small but defiant against the darkness. "We're burning this," Paul asked. "We're releasing it," Elliot corrected. "The truth doesn't belong buried. It belongs in the open." As he dropped the lockbox into the fire, the shadow let out a bone-chilling wail. The sound carried through the cemetery, a mixture of rage and sorrow. The flames consumed the paper inside, and with each flicker of light, the shadow began to dissipate. Max stood tall, his barking ceasing as the oppressive presence lifted. The air grew lighter, the cold receding, and for the first time that night, the cemetery felt peaceful. "It's over," Elliot said, his voice soft. Paul knelt beside Max, scratching behind his ears. "You did it, boy. You brought us here. You knew." Max wagged his tail slightly, his eyes still scanning the shadows as if ensuring the threat was truly gone. The first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the cemetery. The tension of the night melted away with the light, leaving only an eerie calm in its place. Elliot and Paul stood in silence, staring at the charred remains of the lockbox. The confession, Walter's guilt, and the weight of his sins had been released, leaving nothing behind but ashes. "I guess Max was right all along," Paul said, his voice heavy with gratitude. "Knew there was something that needed to be made right." Elliot nodded, his hand resting on Max's head. "Dogs have a way of seeing things we can't. Maybe it's instinct, or maybe it's something more, Gaw." As they left the cemetery, Max trotted beside them, his tail wagging gently. The past had been laid to rest, and with it, a lingering darkness that had haunted the town for years. Max, the unexpected hero, had led them to the truth, proving that sometimes the most loyal companions are also the most perceptive. And as the morning light bathed the town in warmth, Elliot couldn't help but feel that the line between this world and the next had grown just a little thinner that night.